We are, of course, in our never-ending series, the book of Hebrews, the new priesthood, new hope, new covenant. And because the argument builds upon what has come beforehand, it helps us to understand what we looked at previously. So I'll be doing a bit of a review, and then we'll move on into new material. So previously in the book of Hebrews, we're in chapter 11, everybody's favorite chapter. For some people, it's the only chapter they know in the book of Hebrews. But Hebrews 11 is like the greatest hits of the book of Hebrews. If anybody has anything memorized, it's only going to come from chapter 11. So let's take a look at where we've been, and we'll move in and build on the argument that we have laid. It begins with this great statement. Now, faith is the assurance. I would say actually substance is a better translation of that particular word. Faith is the substance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. In other words, now faith is the confident belief in God's ability to carry out his expressed purpose. That is what faith is, confident belief in God. First of all, God. Did you know that Gallup, they do a survey every year regarding Americans' religious proclivities and attitudes, and our nation has dropped precipitously since 2016 in how many people, what the percentage of people who believe in God. We are now down to 74%. But actually, if you take not only God, but you actually also speak of heaven, hell, angels, Satan, we're actually down to get not the trifecta, but the fivefecta of all five of those. We're down precipitously to like 51% in our nation. Why is our nation where it is? We're losing people. Where did that faith? Did these people die? Was it 79% in 2016, and now a mere 7 years later, we're down to 74% because that 5% of the people died off, and well, at that current trend, then in another 30 years, 50% of the people will believe in God, and 50% won't. Where are we going to be? Or are we actually seeing people jettison their faith in God? We must be strong. We must cultivate a strong backbone, which is not ironic for me to say, actually, with my back in a position it's in. By the way, I went to see the specialist. No surgery right now, thank God. Just a rigorous round of physical therapy. But nonetheless, while my doctor was looking at the X-ray and the MRI of my spine, he said, for a 58-year-old guy, I've seen a lot of young people whose spines look a lot worse than yours. Well, that's one way. You could take it one way and say, well, how bad is it that you're looking, and what are the 20-something people doing to their spine? I actually just took it as, you have the spine of a 20-something-year-old guy. But the point being that our spiritual spines must be strong. Our knees must not go wobbly. I don't know what's happening to the rest of the country, but for us, we must remain strong in our confident belief in God's ability to carry out his expressed purpose. And faith is the substance, the foundational basis or essence underlying any attitude of assurance. In other words, we're not talking about blind optimism. We're not talking about, well, I hope this is true. We actually have a foundational basis, an essence that underlies. It's not blind faith. It's not a leap of faith. We have reasonable faith because we've seen God keep his promises in the past. He has a really good track record. Now, in all fairness, just like the stock market, past performance in stocks is no guarantee of future performance. They always warn you, and you got to look at the fine print when you buy a mutual fund. But God's not a mutual fund. God is God. And he has a tremendous, multi-generational, shall we say, track record. One that we can place our faith in. Of that which is hoped for, and that's, of course, our certain expectation. Our expectation has to be certain. Not just, maybe yes, maybe no, a certain. Are you certain? Yes. Are you 100%? Yes. Our certain expectation that God will make good his promises. I put down money at the track on a horse. I may have a reason based upon the horse's pedigree and whether he's a mudder. That's not a father, mother, parent. It's whether they run well in the mud. Whatever his, I may have a reasonable expectation that the horse will do well. But we're not talking about reasonable expectation. We're talking about certain expectation that God will make good his promises. That's faith. So the personal conviction that what is at present not yet personally seen. I don't see it now. But I have a personal conviction, even though I'm not enjoying the promise realized. I'm not grasping it yet. But nonetheless, I have a certain expectation that it will become objectively realized in the future. Why? Because I trust God. And I invite you to do the same with a strong spine and stiffened knees. For by it, faith, the men of old gained approval. And by the way, this is the testimony of our predecessors in faith. That's another way of saying men of old gained approval. This is how our forefathers, our spiritual forefathers, succeeded. This is their witness. This is they're in the dock and they're giving testimony. This is what God did for us. We are the latest iteration. Don't break the chain. Our children, our grandchildren, and future generations, the Lord tarries, are counting on us. Don't drop the baton. And we looked at 23 times. He goes through a list of ancestors, forefathers, beginning with Abel, by faith. 23 times we see that phrase, by faith. And we see Abel, by faith Abel. And then by faith Enoch, who was raptured. Because without faith, it's impossible to please him. In other words, being wishy-washy about, God, Jesus, it'll all pan out, whatever. I'll just hope for the best, expect the worst. I don't know. Without faith, that certain expectation, it is impossible to please him. And again, I want to remind you that this is not surrendering your intellect. This is not blind faith. It's reasonable faith based upon a track record that extends to the very beginning of time. For he who comes to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of those who seek him. Do you believe that God has a reward for those who seek him? I got news for you. The very fact that you're seeking him is indication that he's already sought you, and you're already beginning your road to rewards because he found you, and that lit up your spiritual brainstem. And you said, God. So, when we think about the necessity of faith, there are certain absolute elements. And the first is belief in the existence of God. And the second is the belief in the God who exists, the belief that the God who exists is characteristically and reliably in the business of keeping his promises. We've gone over that now. This is the third week. We're going over that same idea because it is foundational to everything you see in chapter 11. And actually, I think it's foundational to our faith journey. The author of Hebrews is giving us a timeless template that we can apply to our lives. We looked at Noah. By faith, Noah, who built an ark, even though it hadn't yet started to rain, he prepared, and if he hadn't started before it rained, he would not have finished his ark. And again, I want to remind you, I believe that we as the believers need to take back the rainbow, which was hijacked for another purpose, and we want to remind people of God's covenant with mankind and all of creation, that he will never again destroy the world by a flood. Even though it may be sorely tempting, I understand. But the question that I had for you then and now, that I asked you to ponder, do we, like Noah, possess the faith to see the future as present certainty? If Noah hadn't seen the future as present certainty, he wouldn't have put one board nailed against the other. Do we have that kind of faith? We see what God says about the future, what is in store for us, and do we view that as certain? Because the others will laugh at us. They laughed at Noah. But the scorn of others never trumps our faith. It must not. Although I can't help but wonder with those 74%, that was 79, it was 80%. Just less than a decade ago. Where did those believers go? The scorn of others never trumps our faith. Does our faith convict the faithless? Well, let's move on. By faith, Abraham, when he was called, obeyed by going out to a place which he was to receive for an inheritance. This is the Abrahamic covenant. Lech lecha, go from go from Haran, and go to a land that God promised, and you hadn't seen it. But it's an inheritance. Go. Even though you haven't seen it. Trust God and obey. Trust and obey. There is no other way. And speaking of Abraham gets a little bit of a elongated section here. By faith, he, Abraham, lived as an alien, as a sojourner, as a wanderer, as a ger, in the land of promise, as in a foreign land. Abraham and his whole family, his whole mishpucha, they lived, even though it was the land that was promised to them, the promised land, they didn't get to enjoy it as the promised land. They lived as strangers, as aliens, as sojourners, by faith. Dwelling in tents, Abraham did with Isaac, his son, and Jacob, his grandson, fellow heirs of the same promise, that promised land. And the promised land, Canaan, was just an appetizer, because for Abraham, the main course was never about just the physical promised land, the land of Canaan, whatever its borders wound up being. No, for Avram, the main course was the heavenly Jerusalem, the transcendent city of cities. This is something that Avram believed way, way back. This is not something that came a new development in the book of Revelation or in the New Testament. Oh, okay, spiritual Jerusalem, a new heavens and a new earth. No. This is something that goes back, Hebrews tells us, is all the way back in the mind and in the time of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And in fact, not only Abraham, but his partner, his wife, Sarah, by faith. Even Sarah herself received the ability to conceive even beyond. And again, remember I mentioned last week that actually that's a very polite way to put it in the English translation, but actually it's not about Sarah's proclivity to conceive. It actually has everything to do with Abraham, who apparently is not Anthony Quinn, and has to do with him being able to deposit what needed to be deposited in Sarah's womb. So even beyond the proper time of life, Abraham was able to pass on conception, since she, Sarah, or depending on how you want to translate that, considered him faithful who had promised. Either way, whether we're going for Sarah or whether we're going for Abraham, both of them had not tangoed for quite some time, and it was time, according to the word of the Lord, for both Sarah and Abraham to get those dusty dancing shoes on and get back on the dance floor, because God's got great things coming. Therefore, there was born, even of one man, and even he as good as dead as that. That's why I tell you it has to do with Abraham. Abraham is the focus here, the faith of Abraham. He's at this age, and he's going to be able to make a helpful deposit. Yeah, him as good as dead. But nonetheless, for born from him was as many descendants as the stars of heaven in number, and innumerable as the sand which is by the seashore. In other words, multiple generations, countless generations that came from Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. All these, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Sarah, they died in faith without receiving the promises. What promises? The promise of ownership of this land, to enjoy the land as owners. But having seen them, the promises, and welcomed them from a distance, having confessed that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. So in other words, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they didn't get to enjoy the promises, but nonetheless, they held on to the faith, even though they didn't get to enjoy. And going on now. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, you remember this, the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, Genesis 22. When he was tested, offered up Isaac. And he who received the promises was offering up his only begotten, his unique, say, in another son. This means his unique son, the son of promise, his only son, the son of promise. Right? Ishmael was not the son of promise. Isaac was. Everything, every bit of what Abraham had faith that he was going to receive was resting on the conduit of Isaac, because without Isaac, there aren't multiple descendants who are receiving this covenant. So he offered up Isaac. It was he to whom it was said, in Isaac your descendants shall be called. This is Abrahamic Covenant 101. The covenant passes from Abraham to Isaac, and from Isaac to his son. Isaac also had two children. And it goes from Isaac to Jacob, not to Esau. You break the whole chain if you break Isaac, if you end Isaac's life. Think about the faith that was required. He considered, here's, again, this is how it's reasonable faith. Doesn't, so I guess I'll hope for the best. No. He considered, his faith was thought-based, was reason-based. He considered that God is able to raise people even from the dead, from which he also received him back as a type. Now, telling us, the author is telling us that Isaac is actually a prophetic type of our Messiah. So, in this case, it's just a picture. Messiah, he actually did die, and he came back from the dead. Now, before Yeshua, 2,000 years before Yeshua was born, Abraham had this concept in his mind. He said, if two old people are able to give birth to a child of promise, and all the promises are based upon this guy living and propagating future generations, then it stands to reason that even if I sacrifice him, God will bring him back from the dead. If God can create the heavens and the earth, then what's so difficult about raising somebody from the dead? That's Abraham's thought, according to the author of Hebrews. God is able to raise people even from the dead. Therefore, Isaac winds up being a type for us. 2,000 years before Jesus was even born, that God can indeed, someone dead, raise him up and bring him back. And we move from Abraham to his son Isaac. Once again, we see the term by faith. By faith, Isaac, remember, has 2 children. He blessed Jacob and Esau, even regarding things to come. His blessing, and remember the whole shenanigans with the blessing, where Jacob comes in dressed as Esau. It's a cosplay, but Isaac's eyesight is shot, and Jacob receives the blessing of the firstborn, again, regarding things to come, prophetic future things, which were spoken by faith by Isaac in the blessing of, well, first, both Jacob, who received the blessing of the firstborn, but Esau also received a blessing. And here we see in Genesis 27:29, Isaac saying of Jacob, the secondborn, who's receiving the firstborn blessing, may people serve you, may nations bow down to you, be master of your brothers, may your mother's sons bow down to you, that would be Esau. Cursed be those who cursed you, and blessed be those who blessed you. That should sound familiar because that takes us all the way back to Genesis 12:3, which is part of the first iteration, the core of the Abrahamic covenant that was promised by God directly, hot off the press, to Abraham before he even left from Haran. And by faith, Jacob, as he was dying, this is in Egypt, after Joseph has brought everybody back. He blessed each of the sons of Joseph. Remember, we have Ephraim and Manasseh, and Jacob is actually, he takes Ephraim and Manasseh as his own sons. He counts them as his own, which is why there is a tribe of Ephraim and a tribe of Manasseh, but no official tribe of Joseph, because Joseph actually winds up, it skips that generation, it goes to the grandchildren. And just like Isaac did with Esau and Jacob, the eldest and the youngest are switched. He switches his hands like this when he puts the blessing on the 2 children, and worshiped leaning on the top of his staff. He blessed Joseph. This is the Genesis 48, almost at the end of the book. Genesis 48, Jacob is almost at the end of his life. Genesis 48, 15 and 16, he blessed Joseph. And he said, the God before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked, the God who has been my shepherd all my life to this day, the angel who has redeemed me from all evil, bless the lads. Hands crossed over the heads of the grandchildren. And may my name live on in them and the names of my fathers, Abraham and Isaac. And may they grow into a multitude, sands in the seashore, stars in the heavens. May they grow into a multitude in the midst of the earth. And then we move to Joseph. By faith, Joseph, when he was dying, Jacob's died. Now Joseph, when he's dying, made mention of the exodus of the sons of Israel. What exodus? It hadn't happened yet. Moses is not yet born. They're not even enslaved yet. But he knows they will be. And Joseph, when he was dying, made mention of the exodus of the sons of Israel. And he gave orders concerning his bones, his remains. So the latest paragon of faith, Joseph, and even on his deathbed, Joseph's faith was manifested, reminding his children of the future certainty of their eventual exodus from Egypt. And he instructs the children of Israel to take his body to the homeland. No, don't leave me under some pyramid here. Don't forget about my body. Don't leave me in a sarcophagus in a pyramid in Egypt. You pick the whole kit and caboodle up which is Hebrew, by the way, for chit and caboodle, and take me to the land of promise and reinter me there. Joseph said to his brothers, I'm about to die, but God will surely take care of you and bring you up from the land, from this land to the land which he promised on oath. Again, Abrahamic covenant on oath to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. The Abrahamic covenant passes from Abraham to Isaac to Jacob and to the 12 sons and their progeny, the tribes. Joseph made the sons of Israel swear, saying, God will surely take care of you, and you shall carry my bones up from here. So, question that made me think was, do we possess an enduring faith that powerfully sustains the confident hope that God's promises will find eventual fulfillment? We see examples here for us to follow, but I want you to look into your heart. I want you to ponder, I want you to consider, how enduring is your faith? Can it powerfully sustain your confident hope? Does it sustain your confident hope that what God promised will find eventual fulfillment even though you may not see it right now? Do we possess a future-oriented faith perspective? One that can look beyond the ever-present now and take the long view? Right? You're driving on the road, looking 15 yards in front of you, or you're looking right there, right over your hood. If you're driving right on, watching right over your hood, you're in trouble. There's no way to drive. So, how can we foster, if we're struggling in that area, how can we foster a future-oriented faith perspective? How can we, if we have one, how can we help to kindle that future-oriented faith perspective in others? If our lives are not changed day by day, if we're not being strengthened in the faith, that's a problem. If we're having no impact in our sphere of influence, some of us have smaller spheres of influence, some have larger sphere, whatever, it doesn't matter, however large your sphere of influence is. Can you help kindle that future-oriented faith perspective in others? You're making a difference. Somebody asked a question. It's a great, interviewed, that's what it was. I was interviewed for a web program. And I said, yeah, if a particular church, any particular church were to go out of business next week, would anyone other than those people who attended on the regular, would anybody notice? Would it have an impact? If it doesn't have an impact, if they go out of business, then they must not be having much of an impact while they are in business. So I know that's not the case for us. And I know that each one of us is having an impact, some kind of impact, in encouraging others. Our country may have dwindled to 74% believing in God, but not on my watch, in my sphere of influence. I'm going to rage against the tide. I'm not going to let that good night proceed. I will rage against the dying of the light. Well, but that's Dylan Thomas, not Bob Dylan like some people think. Anyway, but move to Moses. You can't go wrong with Moses. By faith, Moses, when he was born, he was hidden for 3 months by his parents. So not only Moses by faith, but his parents by faith, because Moses is a baby, how much faith does he have? It's a parents, that's what we're talking about here. Because they saw he was a beautiful child, and they were not afraid of the king's edict, right? Moses was born and nurtured within an atmosphere of fear and loss, right? Sweeping through the entire community of Israel because they were compelled by Pharaoh's decree. They had to comply with Pharaoh's decree that all male Jewish babies be destroyed. But Amram and Yocheved, Moses' parents, They realized that their son was unique, special child of destiny. I'm not crazy about it. It's a beautiful child. It's a rare word, only shows up here. But every Jewish parent thinks their child is, every parent, period, thinks their child's a beautiful. This is not why they saved him. They realized he was a unique child, same as Isaac, and the language used there regarding that he's a child of destiny. And because they had faith, they were not afraid of the king's edict to throw your children into the Nile. And if you didn't comply, that was the end of your family. And of course, eventually they couldn't hide him any longer. They stuck him in a basket. And by faith, they pointed it, Miriam was there, his sister, to make sure it went right in front of the daughter of Pharaoh, the royal court. Pharaoh commanded all his people, saying, every son who was born, Exodus 1:22. Every son who is born you to cast into the Nile. Every daughter you to keep alive. We'll have a little intermarriage. Before long, there'll be no Hebrew people. Now a man from the house of Levi went and married a daughter of Levi. This is Amram and Yocheved. The woman conceived, bore a son. When she saw that he was beautiful, she hid him for 3 months. A child of destiny. But when she could hide him no longer, she got him a wicker basket and covered. She went to a Container Store or Bed Bath & Beyond, and she had a wicker basket, paid too much for it, I'm sure, like every time. No offense to that store. And covered it over with tar and pitch. She put the child into it, set it among the reeds by the bank of the Nile. Again, the story goes on that the daughter is there to make sure where the child actually. They're not leaving things to chance. It's a reasonable faith. But bottom line, in a time of paralyzing dread and devastating loss, which is the period of time we're talking about, when Israel were enslaved and their firstborn, an entire generation, dies, Moses' family's fear was overcome by their faith. How's that fit for you? Is it too on the nose to ask, is your fear on the regular overcome by your faith? Is it a neck and neck struggle? Is it no contest? Let's move on. By faith, Moses, now we're already with Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. That's Hatshepsut, by the way. That was his mama. And he refused to be called this. There's a whole movie, Prince of Egypt. Got news for you. That's only chapter 1. Prince of Egypt, because Moses actually refused that title. He refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to endure ill treatment with the people of God, to be treated as a slave, than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin. For Moses, as the prince, it's good to be the prince. For Moses, it was Egypt time, and the living was easy. He said, no, my people are suffering. I will identify with my people. And I will suffer with them rather than enjoy the passing pleasures of sin. Considering the reproach of Christ. Now, I don't think we're talking about Jesus, the Messiah here. It simply says the approach of the Anointed One. I think actually, just as the author used Isaac as a type of the Messiah, I think he's calling Moses the Anointed One, that child of destiny, that special figure. Say, the approach of he's the Anointed One. Considering his approach, but he's a type of Messiah, the type of the ultimate Anointed One, but he considered his reproach greater riches than the treasures of Egypt. That makes sense in context. For he was looking to the reward. What reward? The only reward that he and every Jew knew or should have known about, the Abrahamic covenant. The promised land, the possession, the ownership, the enjoyment of the promised land. But Moses, as God's chosen vessel, knew that the riches of the treasures of Egypt were trumped by God's plan in the future. Of course, if Moses had known all the headaches that the people of Israel were going to give him over the next 40 years, or 80 years later, he might have rethought, but he didn't know that nonetheless. And even after they aggravate him to no end, Moses still consistently goes to bat for his people. Nonetheless, let's move on. We have the story here in Exodus 2, verse 10 and 11. The child grew, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, that's Miriam, and he became her son. She named him Moses because I drew him out of the water. It came about in those days when Moses had grown up that he went out to his brethren, and he looked on their hard labor as he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his brethren. So he identifies with the Hebrews because Moses maintained a future-oriented perspective. And that perspective enabled him to endure temporary suffering, even the suffering endured by a slave, in order to gain God's permanent reward. Whatever you go through today is temporary. It may seem chronic, it may be ongoing, but ultimately it's temporary. Keep that future-oriented perspective and understand that at the end is God's reward, and it's not temporary. It is permanent. That's a motivator. By faith, Moses, he left Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, Thutmose III. That's him right there. For he endured as seeing him who is unseen. That's Moses' perspective. Remember Exodus 2? This is where he kills the Egyptian. He looked this way, that way, when he saw there was no one around, struck down the Egyptian, hit him in the sand. Pharaoh heard of this matter, tried to kill Moses. Moses fled from the presence of Pharaoh and set up the land of Midian and sat down by a well. Moses' future-oriented faith in God enabled him to overcome his current fear of Pharaoh. Think Moses wasn't afraid of Pharaoh? Of course he was afraid of Pharaoh. That's why he fled. You don't flee if you're not in fear. But did his fear trump his faith? No. His faith trumped his fear. We're not blind, right? We have certain anxieties. We have certain fears. We're not blind. We can read the writing on the wall. We can tell what time it is. And it's probably healthy to be afraid. But the question is that the motivating force in your life? Fear or faith? Does faith yield to fear, or does fear yield to faith? Well, by faith, still on Moses here. He kept the Passover and the sprinkling of the blood, on the doorposts and on the lintel of the door. It took faith. Nobody saw the firstborn die until after the blood was applied to the door. And if you didn't apply the blood to the door, you were like the people in Noah's day who didn't build an ark. It tut-tut, it looks like rain. And before you know it, there's nobody left except Noah and the ark, his family. But it's a good thing they had faith to keep the Passover, to apply the blood on the doorposts and the lintel, so that he who destroyed the firstborn would not touch them. So the mention of original Passover, the first Passover, the OG Passover, it was a reminder, and getting back to the warning passages in Hebrews that everybody gets uptight about, it's a reminder that once announced, God's judgment is certain. God's judgment had been announced on the generation of Israel because of the actions of their leaders. And he's reminding the readers of Hebrews, do not associate with those without faith. You have faith. Just because you're afraid doesn't mean that your fear dictates how you live. If you allow that to happen, remember, judgment's already been announced. It's certain. Don't be associated with that gang. Because just as God had devastated the Egyptians, so he would judge the generation of Israel who had rejected his provision of his son. A nation is always judged on the actions of their leaders. If that doesn't give you fear and pause and anxiety as a principle, I don't know what would. At this hour, for the recipients of the author of the letter to the Hebrews, that sermon, any attempt by the recipients of Hebrews to temporarily wipe away or cover over the saving blood of the Lamb of God was unthinkable. The culture does not like a song because the song is popular, and some people view it as racist and problematic. We can't listen to that song anymore. It's nonsense. We must not allow the pressure of a contrary culture to close us down, to cancel us, to wipe away or cover the saving blood of the Lamb of God. It's unthinkable. If our culture finds child trafficking repugnant, if we are pressured by the government, social media, culture, whatever it is, to say, well, it's not as bad as you think it is, fake news, whatever. No. Do not back down. Keep your spine straight and your knees locked into position. It's fight or flight. The readers of Hebrews were flirting with flight. Not for believers. Not for them then, and not for us now. Stand up. Moving now from Moses to the children of Israel. By faith, they, the children of Israel, passed through the Red Sea as though they were passing through dry land. It probably wasn't like you saw in the movies. Oh, Charlton Heston is leading us. Okay, if it's Charlton Heston in front of us, we can get, let's go, let's walk, Mandalay. No. If you're looking at walls of water that 5 seconds ago was a sea, and you walk, I would have been afraid. But I also would have had faith. And they had faith. They had fear, but their fear did not trump their faith. And so their faith caused them to pass through the Red Sea as if they were passing through dry ground. And the Egyptians, who then saw, oh, okay, let's go, giddy up. When they attempted it, they were drowned. Oops. Depends on what you have faith in. Depends on whom you have faith in. Well, who is the object of your faith? Overcoming any initial fear, apprehension, misgiving, or incredulity as the waters part, Israel's Exodus generation pressed forward. How'd they do so? By faith. We too can press forward. By faith. And by faith, the walls of Jericho fell down. Yeah, you want me to march how many times? How many days? 7, and then 7 days. Okay, around the wall, 6 days once, and then 7 days, 7 times. And we're going to blow the really? And then at the end of that, the walls are going to miraculously, they're going to fall? Really? Yeah, that took faith. Because that was not a natural occurrence, right? You think it was a sonic blast? And that the marching of the people around somehow made the surrounding turf unstable? That's nonsense. It was the power of God. And it took a tremendous amount of faith for them to obey Joshua, march around 6 days, and the seventh day, and then to shout, blow the trumpets. And by faith, those walls of Jericho fell down after they had been encircled for 7 days. Notice, by the way, before we get to our last example for today, that is a wall, a remainder of a wall from Jericho. And somebody helpfully, I don't believe that's the original one, they threw Rahab's scarlet cord over the side so it could be seen. I don't think that's the original one, but it's helpful for us to be able to envision, okay, what it was like. So you think this ragtag army circling a walled, fearsome city, what fears, what apprehensions, what misgivings or feelings of incredulity must have been overcome by them to act. But forget about them. What's in it for me? What's in it for you? What must we overcome in order for us to press forward? By faith. Final example. Rahab. By faith. The only gal, okay, you can count Sarah if you want, but Rahab is actually modified by the by faith. Sarah gets in there by associating with Abraham. But Rahab gets her own by faith. By faith, Rahab, the harlot, did not perish, along with those who were disobedient. After she had welcomed the spies in peace, remember Joshua sent some spies before they marched around the walls of Jericho. And here we have Joshua 2:8 through 13. The spies are meeting Rahab, and Rahab is sheltering them and protecting them. Now she's hiding them, in other words. Before they lay down, she came up to them on the roof and said to the men, I know Jehovah has given you the land. I know that. It means she has certain faith. She has a certain assurance. Why? Because the terror of you has fallen on us, and all the inhabitants of the land have melted away before. Because of your past track record, word has gotten back to us how your God acts. We know He's God. He's the real God. And He's going to act. And as He'd acted in the past, we're afraid He's going to act in the future. She has faith. I know God has given you the land. When we heard it, our hearts melted, and no courage remained in any man any longer because of you. For Jehovah, your God, He is God, in heaven above and on earth beneath. Now therefore, please swear to me, because she has faith, she gets this concession from the spies. It's a pretty fair deal. Swear to me by Jehovah, by your God by name specifically, not just a general swear by heaven, but by the name of your God, your covenant God. Since I've dealt kindly with you, you will also deal kindly with my father's household and give me a pledge of truth and deliver our lives from death. That's where that scarlet cord. So they knew, and that little piece of wall remained protected. Her apartment, the family's apartment, was on the wall. And so that remained protected. See, Rahab has a clue. We need to grab that clue as well. And the author is trying to communicate to the recipients of Hebrews to get that same clue, the clue of Rahab. Rather than remain associated with the people under divine judgment, Rahab's faith led her to choose decisive identification with the people of God. As Elijah put it centuries later, how long halt ye between two opinions? You straddle the fence long enough, you're going to split your britches. It's very uncomfortable. But instead, we are encouraged, as our forefathers were as well, to stand on our own 2 feet, not to turn back, not to turn to the left or the right, Keep our eyes fixed solidly on the road before us, on that road, on that reward that awaits us. And keep our eyes fixed on our Savior, on our Messiah. Can we handle anything our society, our media, our government throws our way? Yes, we can. We can bear it. We can handle it because we have a future-oriented perspective. We may not always know the what, but we have a faith certainty regarding the whom. So let us live our lives in light of that future perspective. Next week, we'll finish up chapter 11, and we'll see the rest of the list as the author concludes this chapter, concludes his encouragement, and we move headlong into the climax of the book. But for now, let's stand for the Aaronic benediction.